I'm Barbara Perry, and I direct the Presidential Studies program here at the Mileur Center, and along with my colleague Russell Riley, co-direct the Presidential Oral History program. And I am sort of at a bittersweet moment because this is the last of our 2017 Historical Presidency lecture series on the President and the Constitution. But I can assure you that this series will continue starting at the end of January, so keep on the lookout for your next schedule. We will have another 6 or 7 lectures as part of this series, and the topic will be the United States and the world. So the internationalism concept, particularly as we commemorate the 100th anniversary of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points. So the first lecture will be, in fact, on Woodrow Wilson, and this will carry through then the calendar year of 2018. So as I say, be on the lookout for that information. We couldn't have a better anchorman for this 2017 series on the President and the Constitution, and that is because it is Sid Milkis, my colleague here at the Mileur Center, and I give him and Russell Riley and Governor Belials much credit for bringing me here from Sweet Bar College. I know without them I probably would not be here, so thanks to them for that. Sid is the White Burkett Miller Professor of Politics here at the university, and he's a faculty associate here at the Mileur Center. Sid is a native of Philadelphia, and he will tell you at any opportunity about his beloved Eagles, and they are having a good season, I understand. He has his BA degree from Muhlenberg College and received his PhD at Penn, and then went on to teach at DePaul College in Indiana, and then on to Brandeis, and then finally here to UVA. So we're so happy that he is here, because Sid is among the top scholars in the field of the presidency in political science, and in fact he has produced the #1 selling textbook for college classes on the presidency, in addition to having written a total of 12 books, primarily on the presidency, particularly on Theodore Roosevelt and the Progressive Party and the 1912 election. I can remember coming before I was here at the Mileur Center on the faculty, and coming one evening to hear Sid speak on that topic, and it was fascinating. I also just had the opportunity a couple of weekends ago, thanks to Sid's invitation, to go with him to the Wye Plantation on the Wye River on the eastern shore of Maryland, at the invitation to him, and then, as I say, to me, to co-teach with him for the Aspen Institute. And we had a class of about 20 people, much like yourselves, who are interested in the presidency and history and leadership. And we just had a wonderful weekend there talking to them about the presidency. But I was really just tagging along. Sid did all of the heavy lifting and put together the reader for the students, consisting primarily of the things he's written on the presidency. And I was there to sort of fill in the gaps on occasion and, of course, talk about the Kennedys. But it just made me realize again how much Sid knows about the presidency. His knowledge is certainly comprehensive. And so today he's going to share with us, and the reason I say he's the perfect anchorman, not only because of this breadth of knowledge, but the topic that he chose is a perfect circle with, if you were here for the first in this series, which was last February, Sai Prakash, our colleague at the law school, who spoke about how presidents, through very specific policies, actually amend the Constitution informally. And in a way, Sid's going to give us the broad view of that, the broad sweep of history, and how through presidents have, through their changes in the regime, change therefore in a way and refound our Constitution, our constitutional structure through transformative presidents and presidencies. And so that is the topic that Sid will share with us today for about, he says, about 45 minutes or so. And then we'll have our usual conversation here at the table. And then we will turn to you for your questions and comments. And if you will wait for the microphone, I think our colleague Alfred Reeves will come around with that so that you can be picked up on Facebook Live. And of course, we also archive those as well on our website. So with that, please give a warm Mileur Center welcome to Sid Milkis.
Hi, how are you? You doing all right? Well, it's thank you for that very generous untrue introduction, Barbara. It's really, Barbara is such a wonderful, generous colleague. It's really, if whatever I had to do with getting her here is the best thing I've done since I got to the Mileur Center. It's a daunting and top responsibility to anchor this great speaker series, and I'm honored to make an effort to do that. I must tell you, when I ran track, I was a terrible anchor and lost a whole lot of races. So I hope I do a better job with the baton today than I did during my track days. Donald Trump's surprising election and the controversial first year as president that he has experienced, it seems to me, has had one clear, salubrious effect. It has piqued our interest in the relationship between executive power and the Constitution. Although President Trump, an iconoclastic businessman who has never served in public office of any kind, might represent a novel development in American politics, the proper role of the executive in a representative constitutional government has been a source of heated debate since the founding. In fact, two of the most important framers, Alexander Hamilton, now a hip-hop star, and James Madison, who shared with Hamilton the nom de plume Publius in authoring the brilliant Federalist Papers, still, I think, the best defense of America's fundamental law, quickly found themselves in bitter disagreement over the proper scope of presidential power. This dispute was aroused by George Washington, our first president's 1793 Neutrality Proclamation, which announced that the United States would not join in the hostilities then taking place between France and Great Britain. Madison, then in the House of Representatives, sided with Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson in considering Washington's executive action, since it was taken without congressional approval, to be unconstitutional, especially since the president acted unilaterally to abrogate a 1778 treaty that committed the United States to provide France, as the treaty put it, with any necessities of war that had to be brought across the Atlantic. Of course, France was our great ally during the Revolution. Secretary of the Treasury Hamilton, under the name of Pacificus, dismissed his former political ally's view with a really sweeping defense of presidential prerogative. This sweeping defense rested on the distinction that Hamilton drew between how the Constitution vests authority in the legislature and how it vests power in the executive. Article 1, Hamilton pointed out, states that all legislative powers herein granted, shall be vested in a Congress of the United States. While Article 2 does not restrict executive power, not in that way. The executive power, Article 2 reads, shall be vested in the President of the United States of America. The absence of the words herein granted, Hamilton argued, meant that the executive power was both wide-ranging and vested exclusively in the president, subject only to the exceptions and the qualifications expressed in the Constitution. This constitutional language, Hamilton insisted, merely confirmed the nature of executive power, which he felt was indispensable to the success of a large and diverse republic. Foreign policy in particular, Hamilton claimed, was in its very essence the province of the president. Only the power of Congress to declare war and of the Senate to ratify treaties were exceptions. Madison responded to the Pacificus essays under the name of Helvidius, who was a Roman victim of tyranny. Madison strongly disagreed with his former colleague. A declaration of neutrality was, in effect, a declaration that there should be no war, a decision that rightfully belonged to the Congress. To claim that such action was constitutional, Madison argued, was to imply that the executive had legislative power. Such an argument was, in theory, Madison said, an absurdity, and in practice, it was a tyranny. In the final analysis, Madison believed that democracy, even a refined and enlarged constitutional republic, that is, a government that provided for majority rule, but with due attention to minority rights and competent leadership, even this kind of republic required public debate and judgment that could only take place in the legislature and other public forums. It could not be the sole province of the executive. The tasks of foreign policy, Madison argued, to declare war, to conclude peace, and to form alliances, were as he put it, the highest acts of sovereignty. And to relegate such decisions to executive decree was to destroy the meaning of self-government. Now, as the political controversy over the executive powers that President George W. Bush, Barack Obama, and Donald Trump have exercised in national and homeland security reveals, the contretemps between Hamilton and Madison was only the first debate over the relationship between presidential power and the Constitution. But for the most part, these disputes throughout our history have taken place amid a strong consensus that the success of the framers' grand experiment to create self-government on a grand scale, this exalted, elusive ambition stated in the preamble of the Constitution, urging the people to form a more perfect union, that kind of ambition required extraordinary statesmanship that only a president could provide. Although he joined Madison in condemning Hamilton's sweeping defense of executive prerogative as a recipe for despotism, Thomas Jefferson developed the idea that the president must be a first citizen. And he tried to play that role when he became president. That is, a leader who refined and enlarged the cacophonous voices of American democracy. During his presidency, in fact, Jefferson argued that the executive was justified in operating outside the law as long as it provided the people with standards for judging his actions, for standards for deciding whether this action outside the Constitution was necessary. In fact, when linked squarely to public opinion, Jefferson enthused, the executive would embody American democracy. As he stated in his first inaugural address, only the president could command only the president, let me get this right, this is Mr. Jefferson, only the president could command a view of the whole ground. And so deserved, he continued, the people's support against the error of others who may not condemn what they would not if seen in all its parts. That is, people in the Congress of States that could not command the whole ground. Now, the brilliant French commentator Alexis de Tocqueville, who was here in the early 1830s, anointed Jefferson the apostle of American democracy because Tocqueville said his words and his actions captured the profound ambivalence with which America viewed strong leadership. America viewed strong leadership with a mixture of dread of centralized power and a yearning for, in fact, a fascination with extraordinary leadership. Those considered America's great presidents have always been considered, for better and worse, our guiding stars, a standard we use to measure our leaders, especially during crises. In grappling with the profound challenges of the war against terror and the Great Recession, President George W. Bush and President Barack Obama sought inspiration from and hoped their leadership was worthy of the memory of the country's most celebrated presidents, their most celebrated predecessors. Most notably, they invoked Abraham Lincoln and Franklin Roosevelt. And although not as attentive to history as most of his predecessors, President Trump has closely identified with Andrew Jackson, who led the first populist rebellion against the establishment. Only a few presidents have been deemed worthy of this kind of enduring respect and reverence. My list is Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, and Franklin Roosevelt. You can argue with me about that list later. Even though we find much to criticize in the record of these presidential immortals, as one distinguished historian canonized them, it's hard to deny that they were highly consequential. They carried out, as Hamilton hoped that our most effective leaders would carry out, extensive and arduous enterprises for the public benefit. Cities, towns, and babies are named after these presidents. Monuments are built in their memory. They are the subject of popular movies and docudramas. Even when their memory is abused, even when we contest their memory, they are spoken of with awe. The fact that Americans, I think, crave extraordinary leadership and think that in certain times of our history it has existed shouldn't be taken for granted. I think it speaks to something unusual, if not exceptional, about American political culture. Madison's poignant Helvidius essays drew on the experiences of Greek and Rome that dramatically revealed the perils of celebrated leaders like Pericles and Caesar. Extraordinary leaders traditionally had been viewed as a problem in democracy before the Constitution was written. Put simply, they threatened to rob the people of their sovereignty. Greatness in leaders appears more appropriate for monarchy than it does for democracy. Alexander, Peter, Catherine, Frederick, have I forgotten anyone? They were all called great, but I doubt any of them would do well in the New Hampshire primary. In fact, before the United States Constitution was written, the conventional wisdom was that strong executive power and democracy didn't mix. Popular rule, properly understood, worked best in small places where the people could rule themselves, or where the people, if the size of the country made direct rule impossible, where the people delegated authority to representatives jealously, where representatives were kept on a very short leash. Legislatures, not executives, were thought to express the voice of the people. In fact, America's first Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, which were in place from 1781 to 1787, was a highly decentralized political system. And in that highly decentralized political system, there was nothing which deserves the term executive. There was no executive power of any meaning in that government. Now, the history of the American presidency certainly has not completely dispelled the democratic fear of greatness. Consider, for example, the indiscretions of perhaps our two most important presidents. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus and established military tribunals. Franklin Roosevelt, packed the court and interned Japanese Americans. Now, while previous democracies were fearful of great leaders, in spite of these indiscretions we see in some of our most celebrated presidents, Americans are proud of and honor their great presidents. This Mount Rushmore thing, that's pretty weird when considered, when you compare it to the way most other democracies think about powerful leaders. There's nothing like that in France, I guarantee you. I look for one. In fact, I would suggest that the immortals of presidential history are revered as great leaders precisely because they were extraordinary leaders of American democracy. It was said of Lincoln, who's considered our greatest president, that he appeared to be our country's consummate Democrat and the embodiment of the people's government. We therefore revere Lincoln long after he died because he appealed to what is best about America. He appealed to the better angels of our nature. In real and metaphorical terms, Lincoln was, as somebody once put it, everybody grown a little taller. So it has been with all of America's revered statesmen. Washington, Jefferson, Jackson, Lincoln, and FDR all reveal that democratic leadership involves a vital connection between leader and led. That presidential words and deeds can play an important role in shaping the quality and the character of the citizenry. They can make the public more self-regarding, more selfish and craven, or they can encourage it to be a bit more energetic and public-spirited. The development of a mass media providing for a direct link between the White House and the citizenry, I think, has offered novel and sometimes perilous opportunities for civic engagement. As Felix Frankfurter once said of Franklin Roosevelt's pioneering radio fireside chats, Roosevelt had a remarkable ability to take the American people to school on the meaning of their deepest political beliefs in their own time. I would say that all of America's most consequential leaders have displayed this talent to exploit what Theodore Roosevelt, an important inspiration for his younger cousin, dubbed the bully pulpit. They exerted leadership during the finest, but also the most dangerous episodes of constitutional government. They governed from the eye of the political storm. I had to mention that title sometime. and I think that these represent really, truly conservative revolutions. I refer to these episodes of popular constitutional politics as refoundings, because they have required presidents to think constitutionally, to interpret the meaning of the Declaration of Independence, to interpret the meaning of the Constitution, and to think about the relationship between the Declaration and the Constitution, and to do so for the problems posed by their own times, to infuse the framers' principles with new meaning. Lincoln's call for the joining of the principles of the Declaration and the Constitution in a form that condemns slavery to extinction is the most famous. But all of America's most consequential presidents have justified regime change, the rise and fall of political orders, in terms of fundamental principles and constitutional norms. Now, significantly, Americans' refoundings have been collective engagements. They have not come ex cathedra. Presidents have been at the center of the storm, but they've not created new regimes on their own. Perhaps most important, Washington aside, presidents have been, who have really deserved to be called regime builders, have also been extraordinary party leaders. Political parties have not always constrained presidential ambition in a constructive fashion. In fact, all of the presidents who instigated regime change, think about this, they either founded or they fundamentally recast a political party, every one of them. Now, in important respects, these refounding presidents used their parties to remake American politics in their own image. That sounds a little like tyranny. But extraordinary party leadership serves most to highlight, I think, the collective nature of our great political transformations. The alliance between refounding presidents and collective organizations with a past and a future. The connection of presidential preferences to principle, as Martin Van Buren put it, one of the great architects of the Jacksonian Democratic Party. That is one critical difference between democratic statesmanship and demagogues. And by demagogues, I mean popular leaders, as Hamilton warned, who flatter the people's prejudices only to betray their interests. Political parties have kept presidents faithful to broader interests, even as episodically they've given presidents the political strength, the institutional formidable influence to embark on ambitious projects of national reform. Now, I couldn't get those pages apart because I'm scared to get to this next part. Having laid out the relationship between the American presidency and constitutional refoundings. Now what I want to do is to take you on a brief tour, I promise it won't be too long, of the Presidential Hall of Fame. And then, having concluded this tour, I'll reflect briefly on the prospects for and the desirability of another refounding in American politics. And if I don't have time to do the latter, perhaps Professor Perry will engage me in a Q&A on that subject. Washington, of course, we start with Washington, gave literal meaning to the term conservative revolutionary. His bearing and his principles were so conservative that it's hard to conceive of him as a revolutionary. Yet it's difficult to imagine the success of the revolution and the ratification of America's second Constitution in Washington's absence. Not only was he elected to 2 terms unopposed, but the certainty that he would indeed serve as the nation's first president calmed the fears of those among the Constitution writers, who were steeped, after all, in the memory of George III and more ominously popular demagogues. They were persuaded by Washington that it was possible to have a strong executive who was not a monarchy. And in fact, Washington really was the only figure at the beginning of the Second Constitution who connected that document and a government that seemed quite far from the people's eyes and ears to the popular imagination. As James Madison commented in 1789, Washington was the only aspect of the government that really caught the imagination of the people at the outset. Washington's task, therefore, was to transform his enormous popular appeal into respect for the office he occupied and for the Constitution, the second Constitution, he had sworn to uphold, and to do so without arousing fears of presidential despotism. And through an artful combination of assertiveness, like the Neutrality Proclamation and the Whiskey Rebellion, where he himself got on horseback and led the government to put down what he felt was a dangerous act of anarchy in western Pennsylvania, a bunch of drunken Pennsylvanians, through the Neutrality Proclamation and and his leadership in the Whiskey Rebellion, through a combination of strength in those areas and, on the other hand, restraint. Washington gave up the presidency after 2 terms, a great act of restraint for an individual who could have remained president through the rest of his lifetime. There was no question about that. Through this artful combination of assertiveness and restraint, Washington showed the American people that a strong leader did not have to be a king or a despot. In fact, he set precedents that made a democratic chief executive possible. As the foundational dispute over the Neutrality Proclamation revealed, Washington's tenure was hardly free of polarizing conflict. The two most brilliant members of his cabinet, Hamilton and Jefferson, as you know if you saw the play Hamilton, if you're really rich and could get tickets for that, spent considerable time conspiring against and arousing opposition to each other. They were always at each other's throats. But the one matter that remained above the partisan fray, the one matter that made it possible for the nascent Constitution and for its most controversial feature, this strong presidency to endure, was the character and leadership of Washington himself. But I hasten to add that our admiration of Washington should not blind us to the inadequacy of the model he provides for democratic presidential leadership. Washington's success was unique. It was too dependent on the absence of rivals. Because of his extraordinary gifts and the circumstances in which he came to rule, he was able to rise above rivalry and factionalism. But Washington left no legacy capable of suppressing those centrifugal forces that rose up in his absence. It's ironic that the best means for taming factionalism and reconciling rivalry with lawful rotation and power has proved to be an institution that Washington feared and despised the political party. To compound that irony, Thomas Jefferson shared Washington's antipathy to political party. He said, "If I could not go to heaven but as a member of a party, I would not go there at all." Now, of course, Jefferson was a deist, and it was said that deists began their prayers, their salutations, with the words, "To whom it may concern." So maybe we shouldn't be shocked that Jefferson created the first Democratic political party, the Democratic Republican Party, to which both the Democrats and the Republicans of today trace their origins. In what Jefferson called a great contest of opinion, his party, the Democratic Republicans, triumphed in the election of 1800 over the Federalists, who were then headed by his friend and his rival, John Adams. Jefferson called this the Revolution of 1800. This was not an idle boast. It resulted in the first peaceful transfer of power in American history, and perhaps the world. This was a very unusual thing. Just as important, it strengthened the connection between the executive office and the people. Jefferson intentionally downsized the presidency, at least in symbol, to make the president look like more the leader of the people. He dressed very badly in comparison to the way Washington and Adams dressed eloquently and always wore a sword. When Jefferson greeted people at the White House, he often was in his bathrobe, and he never combed his hair. With Jefferson's triumph, consequential presidential leadership, I think, no longer required the stature to transcend partisanship, to transcend the passions and conflicts of democratic life. Thereafter, extraordinary presidents, consequential presidents, had to have the political gifts and talent to master the popular arts and to do it in a way that retained rather than destroyed the Constitution. Through rhetoric, Jefferson cultivated a political climate in which he could bring about profound democratic changes without departing from the constitutional framework established by his Federalist predecessors. He used the occasion of his first inaugural to remind the people, including his most bloodthirsty followers, that change had to be achieved without violating the liberties of their political opponents. "We are all Republicans," he insisted. "We are all Federalists." And his second inaugural address of 1805 explained why the acquisition of the Louisiana Territory, which doubled the size of the country, an action he admitted violated his understanding of limited constitutional government. After all, the Constitution didn't provide for the appropriation of foreign territory. But Jefferson argued in his second inauguration that this was a temporary necessity to secure the foundations of a democratic republic. It would protect liberty in the United States. Jefferson worried that America would become like Europe, where the people were too crowded together. That didn't provide for a society that could reconcile liberty and democracy. To secure the future of American citizens yet unborn in a large but decentralized empire of liberty, as Jefferson called it, it was necessary to greatly expand American territory. And you had the added bonus of getting Napoleon off your doorstep, which was rather a dangerous thing to have, so close by. Now, the famous late historian Arthur Schlesinger Jr. argued that America's most important presidents obtained their status by enhancing the power of their office and the federal government. But that was what the Federalists stood for, expanding the power of the federal government and the president. Jefferson's Revolution of 1800 shows that refoundings have less to do with power than they do with purpose. Jefferson and the Democratic Republican Party's purpose was local self-government. Claiming that only a decentralized republic and a limited executive office could cultivate an active and competent citizenry, he and his Democratic Republican allies dramatically reduced the size of the national government. And it remained shrunken until the Civil War. Even today, the legacy of Jeffersonian democracy is with us. The United States retains important remnants of Jeffersonian democracy, a commitment to the rights of individuals, a mistrust of elites, and a lack of centralized rule that is unique, I think, among modern democracies. Now, in one sense, Jefferson was too successful a Democratic leader. His Democratic Republican Party killed off its Federalist rivals in elections. Federalists resisted the democratic politics that triumphed in the Revolution of 1800 and as a result became extinct. In fact, the Jeffersonians, too, were a bit squeamish about the exercise of the popular arts that they had pioneered. And they made little effort to sustain the vitality of the Democratic Republican Party. And for a time, the United States fell into a one-party mode of politics that from 1812 to 1820 quickly degenerated into a no-party mode. Historians refer to this period between 1812 and 1820, when we were without party politics, as the era of good feelings. Never was an era more inappropriately named. And this, I think, points to the importance of parties. The country suffered under fragmented leadership that had no means to build popular support. And in the War of 1812, among this fractious politics, Jefferson's heir apparent, James Madison, stayed true to the democratic Republican principles of states' rights with disastrous consequences. He seemed to fiddle while the British burned the national capital, a fitting symbol for the decline of national government that continued even after the British retreated. Now, the one kind of episode of that war that was sort of satisfying for the United States was Andrew Jackson's great triumph in the Battle of New Orleans. It came after the peace treaty was signed, but still it was an important event restoring the honor of the United States. So I think it's fitting that it was left to Andrew Jackson and his organizational genius, the organizational genius who supported him, Martin Van Buren, to resurrect, I should say. Sometimes my mind jumps ahead of my lips. Does that ever happen to you guys? To resurrect democratic allegiance through the creation of the Democratic Party, and more importantly, through the creation of an enduring party system. The Jacksonians were the first to defend parties as institutions. And from that defense came a party system with the Democrats and the Whigs. The Whigs were headed by the celebrated Kentuckian Henry Clay. Jackson was the first president to style himself. I looked over at Barbara because that's where she's from, Louisville. I thought she'd be jumping up and down. But Jackson was the first president to style himself as the tribune of the people. That sounded dangerous to Henry Clay, who said he was the Napoleon of America. And Jackson did act forcefully. In killing the National Bank, he took extra constitutional measures. And the National Bank then, of course, was the imposing establishment institution of the 1830s. But Jackson's charisma was routinized and moderated by the Democratic Party and its commitment to a more sober view of states' rights than Jeffersonian democracy had championed. Most important, Jackson complemented his thoroughgoing populism with a crucial act of constitutional statesmanship. He acted quickly and decisively to suppress the proto-secessionist efforts of South Carolina nullifiers, inspired by John C. Calhoun, who sought to claim that the tariff law passed by the national government was null and void in South Carolina, and that South Carolina had this right in a country that really wasn't a union, but a compact of states. Most dangerously, Calhoun claimed to be the rightful heir of Jefferson, because Jefferson had seen the country this way in resisting the Alien and Sedition Acts. In this episode, Jackson taught Jeffersonians how to combine their zeal for states' rights and limited government with a strong attachment to the Union. And of equal importance, he issued the Nullification Proclamation, which is really Whitman-esque in its defense of national democracy and the Union. And that nullification proclamation explained cogently and comprehensively why all Americans should make preservation of the Union, which is essential to liberty, their political priority. Abraham Lincoln wielded this precedent. You following me as we're going to different parts of the museum here? This commitment to union, Lincoln built on in the service of the boldest of all presidentially inspired acts of constitutional change. Lincoln discovered in the purpose of the Union itself a rationale for purging the shameful constitutional provisions that left America half slave and half free, a house divided against itself, calling on Americans to live up to the principles pronounced in the Declaration of Independence, pronouncing the words, all men are created equal forcefully. Lincoln set the standard for presidential civic education. In a series of simple, yet I think really extraordinary speeches, the greatest being the Gettysburg Address, Lincoln explained to the people that the Declaration, not the Constitution, was America's founding document. Do the math. 77 years ago, from 1863. That takes you back to 1776. The Constitution codified slavery as a necessary evil in a fledgling nation, Lincoln argued. The Three-Fifths Compromise is just one of the more notorious compromises the framers of the Constitution made with slavery. Lincoln argued that the Constitution, as circumstances allowed, had to be guided by the Declaration of Independence and its core principle, all men are created equal. Now, of course, Jefferson, who drafted at least the Declaration, and Jackson, who saw himself as kind of building on Jefferson's legacy, invoked the spirit of 1776. But Lincoln reinterpreted the Declaration to invest the Union with a moral, even religious purpose that gave rise to a new, more positive understanding of the natural rights that are codified by the Declaration. These natural rights weren't simply pre-political principles that limited government action. Sometimes they created responsibilities for government action. And Lincoln gave more concrete expression to this new view of liberty in his address to the special session of Congress that convened on July 4th, 1861. And it's not an accident that Lincoln chose July 4th to summon the Congress where he could talk about the war and what needed to be done with it, at least initially. The Union struggle, he told Congress, was to maintain that form and substance of government whose leading object is to elevate the conditions of man, to lift artificial weight from all shoulders, to clear the paths of laudable pursuit for all, to afford all an unfettered start and a fair chance in the race of life. It was the national government's responsibility in this positive understanding of liberty to ensure all men, including slaves, a fair chance in the race of life, to take the chains of slavery off of African Americans. Now, all too often, Americans tend to deify Lincoln, a reverence, I think, that began with his assassination on Good Friday. But the popular movie Lincoln, how many of you have seen that movie? Yeah, a good number of you. See, the good thing about that movie, it dispels somewhat this divine worship of Lincoln. I think it accurately portrays Lincoln as very human. In fact, as a ruthless partisan politician who depended on a strong Republican Party to save the Union and emancipate the slaves. In fact, Lincoln was the most partisan of all refounding presidents. Almost all of Lincoln's stature at the time of his election owed to his being the nominee of the newly formed Republican Party, which replaced the Whigs at the height of the slavery controversy in the 1850s. And of course, he became the Republican Party's first president in 1860. Although Lincoln's attachment to party, as you can see in that movie, constrained him at times, pissed him off at times, it provided him with a critical means for influencing Congress and for mobilizing political support. And his aggressive use of political patronage and his inclusion of the various party factions in his cabinet, which is depicted by Doris Kearns in her book, Team of Rivals, that enabled Lincoln to fully exploit the Republican Party as a vital political resource for the cause of the Union. And now to FDR. And I noticed the poster advertising this talk has FDR on it. And so I better talk about FDR. It also has Churchill. I'm not going to say a thing about Churchill, but I will in the Q&A if you want me to. Now, like Lincoln, FDR sought to save the constitutional order by expanding it, by expanding the idea of rights. In his important Commonwealth Club address during the 1932 campaign and elsewhere, Roosevelt explained that the unspeakable suffering of the Great Depression, where you had over 30% of Americans unemployed, and in major cities, more than half of Americans unemployed. That economic disaster showed dramatically that the economic system, transformed by the Industrial Revolution, would destroy itself if it were not subjected to fundamental constitutional reform. This transformed constitution would be based on a new freedom. Roosevelt called this freedom from want. And it would be grounded in the reality that necessitous men are not free men. Necessitous men and women are not free men and women. With the advent of the New Deal political order, an understanding of rights dedicated to limited government and gradually gave way to a new understanding of rights, requiring the expansion of national programs and administrative power. Even Lincoln's more positive understanding of liberty only called for a fair race of life. Roosevelt was looking for a situation where nobody would lose the race of life, that there would be security for all against the uncertainties, the terrifying uncertainties of the marketplace. Like all refounding presidents since Jefferson, Roosevelt wielded a powerful partisan weapon, the New Deal Democratic Party, which was dedicated to constructing and sustaining the economic constitutional order, as he called it, beyond his own presidency. And although FDR didn't play a pivotal role, of course, in founding the Democratic Party, it was founded by Jackson, he fundamentally recast it. He fundamentally remade it by his ability to attract new loyalists to the Democratic Party, most notably industrial workers and African Americans. That was tantamount to a partisan refounding. The benefits of Roosevelt's party leadership were revealed in 1936. An immense victory that relegated the Republican Party and Herbert Hoover's concept of rugged individualism to the political wilderness. The 1932 election was simply a rejection of Herbert Hoover. I told my students, even I, an academic nerd, could have won the 1932 election. But 1936, with the enactment of some important New Deal statutes, most notably the signature New Deal program, Social Security, required a defense of the New Deal. And the 1936 campaign involved this debate over the future of the New Deal. Roosevelt's opponent, Republican Alf Landon, governor of Kansas, calling for the repeal of Social Security, was badly defeated. He only won 2 states, Maine and Vermont. Now, before this, of course, Maine was thought to be the bellwether of American politics. As goes Maine, so goes America. Well, now it was, as goes Maine, so goes Vermont. And this was a rather meager constellation in support of rugged individualism. It was said of Alf Landon, apparently, that if he had made one more speech, he would have lost Canada. He would have lost Canada. Yeah. It's a joke. It's a joke. Although the person who said that might have been imperialistic. Do I have some time to wrap up here? So I think let me conclude reasonably, pretty quickly. As you know, professors have their own definition of brevity, but I will try to. So I think we still live, and this will be fun to argue about, in a polity that is best defined by the lengthened shadow of the New Deal. In fact, Roosevelt's legacy, big government, the modern bureaucratic state, may have been the last great transformation in American history. And Roosevelt himself may have been the last refounding president. Roosevelt's redefinition of the social contract held that the national government was responsible not just for political liberty, natural rights, such as speech and religion, but also for the economic and social welfare of the American people, for programmatic rights, or as we call them now, policy entitlements, such as Social Security, which protected individual men and women from the uncertainties of the marketplace. In the pursuit of this economic constitutional order, Roosevelt and his New Deal allies aroused intense partisan conflict, condemning their Republican opponents as Tories and economic royalists. Roosevelt therefore strengthened partisanship in the short run and gave rise to still another critical transformation in American history. But that may have been the last partisan transformation in American politics, because the triumph of the New Deal Democratic Party, I would argue, was really only a way station on the road to a more administrative constitution, to a more centralized and bureaucratic form of democracy that focused our political life less on parties and elections and more on the president, administrative agencies, and entitlements. As Roosevelt put it in the Commonwealth Address, the day of enlightened administration has come. And in that sense, Roosevelt boldly was in a sense defining himself as the last man in history. And maybe I've read too much Hegel, but that's what it suggests when I was in college. Now, foreign policy, of course, reinforced these developments of an executive-centered administrative state. The importance of the modern presidency that became an anchor of the New Deal political order and the declining importance of party politics was augmented by World War II and the Cold War. To freedom from want, Roosevelt now added freedom from fear as another guarantee of security required by world events. It signified the government's responsibility to protect Americans and, in fact, all free people against foreign imperialism, to become, as FDR put it, the arsenal of democracy. And in the wake of these developments, with freedom of want being embodied by the welfare state and freedom from fear being embodied by the national security state, which has expanded into the ubiquitous homeland security state, the president, rather than the party, became the leading agent of popular rule. In fact, during his second term, an unprecedented third term, and he even got elected to a fourth term, but died soon thereafter. I have to stay in front of the mic here. My proposition is if Roosevelt hadn't died, he'd still be president of the United States. During that long period, Roosevelt pursued a program that created an executive establishment. And I know this is boring, but it's a really important part of New Deal history. The centerpiece of this program was the Executive Reorganization Act, which was passed in 1939. And this statute, enacted after a bitter 2-year struggle with the Congress, created the Executive Office of the President. And within it, I scream, the White House office, which is popularized. I'm so happy this happened. It was popularized by the Emmy award-winning show, The West Wing, which has become a synonym for the White House office. Now my students listen to me when I talk about this act. The Executive Reorganization Act, I think, is the organic statute of the modern presidency and the modern executive establishment. It transformed the executive, which to this point really was a relatively simple office, into a massive institution and the center of politics and government in the United States. Today, there's a presidential establishment of 6,000 men and women who serve all the immediate needs of the modern presidency. And though LBJ and Reagan have, in a sense, in their own way, both challenged this executive-centered administrative state, I think what they really did, respectively, was to establish a battle for the services of the administrative state that was forged on the New Deal political order, with Democrats now embracing the freedom from want and Republicans now embracing the freedom from fear. That's a little schematic, but I think what we see going on with those two, after those two presidencies, both really important, not refoundings, but the bequeathing of a battle for the services, for the soul, or battle for the soul of the New Deal political order. That sounds a little more meaningful. Now, this isn't to say that party politics isn't important in contemporary American politics. As we've seen in the 2016 election, I've been trying to stay away from it, but I've reached this point now. And its aftermath, partisan rancor and polarization are more central to the polity now than has been the case since the New Deal refounding. But the current battle for the constitutional soul of the American people is diminished, I think, by the executive-centered administrative state that was bequeathed to us by the New Deal refounding, one in which presidents no longer run for office and govern as the head of a party. Instead, they campaign and seek to enact programs as head of a personal organization that they have created in their own image. As Donald Trump roared in accepting the Republican nomination in Cleveland last summer, "I alone can fix it." Now, that kind of presidential bravado and the president's aggressive use of executive power during his first term is the culmination of developments that have been in the making since the consolidation of a presidency-centered democracy during the New Deal. Let me finish by suggesting where we are now. We have a project going on now at the Mileur Center called The Presidency at the Crossroads. This suggests maybe we're in another one of these political storms that we've experienced previously in our history. Another one of these most dangerous but finest moments. And we may come out of the storm and see a new refounding in American politics. On the other hand, let me suggest something more pedestrian. Given the shock of recent developments, perhaps we should be content to live in the absence of extraordinary statesmanship and founding. Perhaps, as Hegel taught, the end of history isn't such a bad thing. And the task for today's effective leaders, and I've thought about this a lot, but I don't know how strongly I feel, but I'm going to put it out there and you guys can react to it. But maybe the task for today's effective leaders might not be to leave their mark on the nation, to build a new political order in their own image, as past great statesmen have. Instead, maybe their responsibility may simply be to do the job, which is awfully difficult and important, to administer the welfare and the national security state that form the core of America's responsibilities at home and abroad. And I think that recent developments herald a clarion call, as the political scientist Hugh Heclo has wisely counseled, for people and their representatives to think institutionally, to reimagine the constitutional and institutional constraints that for much of our history have prevented a Republican executive office from spawning a Caesar, a popular leader who destroyed the Roman Republic. But those who would seek to restore the restraints or refinements of institutions, I think, have to face the imposing obstacle of a government that for years has sacrificed responsible leadership to aggressive and resolute presidential action, and unfortunately appeals to patience and actions of forbearance have become frail vestiges of a polity once praised or blamed for its pragmatic centrism, for its vital centrism. And I see this as a teachable moment. And I think in this teachable moment, when so many people are concerned about the state of the country, when many liberals and conservatives are in search of a new vital center. Our great task might be to somehow amplify these frail voices of reason. Thank you for your patience. I appreciate it.
Well done, Sid. Thanks so much. It gives us plenty to think about and talk about and ask questions about. But I'll throw out some of the first. As I said in my introductory remarks, in thinking about the bookends of our first lecture by Sai Prakash last February on this topic, in which he focused more on in sort of specific policies that presidents have engaged in, that he said, I think correctly, actually amend the Constitution. And that yours is rather a more macro view of actual regime change that presidents engage in, not only by their specific policies, but as you say, founding or refounding parties and creating larger change. As a presidential scholar who has this specialty as well in the founding and knowing what all the founders thought about the presidency and the executive branch and the executive office and what it should do and what it should mean, do you ever worry that presidents have taken on too much power, whether it's specifically amending the Constitution through a specific policy or actually changing the entire regime of our nation's system of government?
Yeah, I mean, I worry about that all the time. and in fact, in my presidency class, I asked them to think about whether these refoundings really strengthen the law, that is, infuse our constitutional principles with new meaning, or they weaken the law. And over time have in a sense, created a Prometheus Unbound, a presidency-centered democracy without constitutional or organizational constraints. And I've never bought this imperial presidency argument that Arthur Schlesinger Jr. Made in 1973 after Watergate, because Schlesinger for many years had been a great defender of the presidency, and then when presidents started getting elected, with whom he disagreed, he suddenly saw this imperial presidency. I don't see the president as all powerful now. I think the presidency suffers from what Woodrow Wilson once referred to as extraordinary isolation. That all presidents now have considerable power. All of them try, in a sense, to remake the political system in their own image. This once was episodic, now it's become routine. It's one thing that connects, I think, as different as they are, Barack Obama and Donald Trump. But they're isolated institutionally from the rest of the political system. And for all their talk to the people, they're sort of cut off, I think, from the rank and file citizenry and what their major concerns are. And I think that's a very dangerous situation where all presidents seek ambitious plans, but they don't have the institutional organizational power to fulfill those. And so that tempts them to circumvent the Constitution. And the circumvention of the Constitution has become a rather regular feature of American politics. I mean, George W. Bush and Barack Obama were very aggressive in taking unilateral action. Most of President Obama's controversial immigration policy, the policies themselves, I can find good reason for, but they were taken unilaterally, and that kind of trend of administrative action has really set Donald Trump up to repeal Obama's agenda unilaterally now. Everybody says he hasn't done anything, no laws have passed, but I've got 10 and a half single-space pages of administrative actions he's taken that have changed the trajectory of almost every important domestic homeland security and foreign policy that we associate with the Obama presidency.
Right. You talked a little bit about media, new media, and FDR's use of it, and a very positive comment by Felix Frankfurter of FDR's use of the fireside chat as a civic education project in taking the American people to school. Could you talk about the development of media beyond that in the modern era into television and now social media and the internet through FDR, JFK, Obama, Trump? And talk a little bit about how that relates to the theories of the rhetorical presidency and how the rhetorical presidency, at least in the FDR realm, certainly it seems to me helped him to be able to be a transformative, regime-changing president. Yeah,
well, I have to say I'm not an expert on the media, but it's clear to me, even someone as dense as me, that it's obvious, it's very, very important. And so Barbara used a term, a political science term, rhetorical presidency. I don't know why we always have to make these concepts up, but this is to have a meta language of political science. This is a term coined by a political scientist, Jeff Toulis, who teaches at the University of Texas, and he says that one thing that really distinguishes the modern presidency, which begins during the Progressive era but is consolidated with the New Deal political order, is the greater opportunity for presidents to speak directly to the people. And that's partly a matter of custom. The country becomes more accepting of presidents talking more often, where it was really expected they wouldn't talk so often in the 19th century. I'm always amused by the fact that one of the articles of impeachment against Andrew Johnson, Article 10, I believe it is for engaging in bad and improper rhetoric. So obviously things have changed. Right? I think you can't get impeached for that anymore. And clearly, it's not just an accident that the mass media comes into existence at the same time the modern presidency does. So these institutional changes I was describing go hand in hand with technological changes. So you get the radio, of course, which allows Roosevelt to go into the living room of the American people. And your guy, your man, John Kennedy, who pioneers the use of television. Obama, I think, pioneers the use of social media. And Donald Trump has really elaborated or simplified that by focusing on tweets.
Right.
Well, the Gettysburg Address is only 272 words, so maybe you can do a lot with those characters.
Oh, he can now do it in a tweet, which now takes 280 words.
I can see the headline on Facebook: Milkis compares Trump to Lincoln's Gettysburg, and I'll be in serious trouble. Right. But I think all those developments go hand in hand with the modern presidency, and I think increase the opportunities for this kind of civic education, but also kind of make the modern presidency more dangerous because it has the possibility, and I think this has happened to a great extent, of creating a cult of personality, where image and symbol replace substance in the presidency, where the presidents themselves, rather than any kind of collective movement, presume to lead the country. And I think that I think one can say a lot of good things about Kennedy and I'm trying to get these in the right order: Reagan, Obama, and we don't know enough about Donald Trump yet. But you can say a lot of good things about them, but to some degree, they sacrificed a record of accomplishment to a cult of personality. And I've always been intrigued by Reagan's 1880, let's see if I can, the problem with studying all this history is you can fly across centuries. So I was going to say 1884. What I want to say is 1984, when Reagan was reelected. I thought that was a possibility for a refounding moment. Reagan had a very successful first term, and he won a dramatic reelection. He won every state in 1984 but Minnesota, which was his opponent Walter Mondale's state, and Washington, D.C. Ever see that map? You can't even find Washington, D.C., so it looks like there's just one blue spot on the map. But it was a lonely landslide. It didn't really translate to the Republican Party. I think in the Congress, the Republicans only picked up 13 seats, which didn't get them close to a majority, which they never had under Reagan's presidency. But this, I thought, was the opportunity. And they lost 2 Senate seats, which was kind of a segue to them losing the Senate in 1986. So, and the slogan of that campaign was morning in America, right? Morning again in America. This soft soap sell, that's part and parcel of this kind of rhetorical presidency or cult of personality, presidency-centered politics that dominates American democracy right now.
Could you talk a little bit
I think comparing 1984 to 1936, where Roosevelt really and the Democratic Party really go after the Republicans and defend the New Deal more systematically.
Right.
That would be an interesting exercise to me. I'm sorry.
So before we open up to questions, one last one from me to you, and that is, could you talk a little bit more about party refoundings or foundings, and particularly what Donald Trump is attempting to do apparently in purging, along with Steve Bannon, purging the traditional establishment members of the Republican Party. It remains to be seen how successful that will be, but maybe take us back into history to FDR's attempt to purge the Democratic Party in 1938.
Yeah, I think both of them are dangerous moments, and maybe necessary moments for change. I will say that I think Roosevelt's was a more collective enterprise, that he had a party that was badly divided between Northern and Southern Democrats. And he felt that the Southern Democrats, particularly in his second term, were really a major obstacle to the development of this economic constitutional order that he thought was central to constitutional sustainability in American politics. And I think that purge campaign was critical in shifting, where Roosevelt went after mostly Southerners and border states. He didn't win a lot of the contests, but the battle was important because it defined the differences between the camps, and I think began a shifting of the center of gravity from the South, which had long been the anchor of the Democratic Party, to the North and West, which prepared the Democratic Party to be a New Deal liberal Democratic Party.
So he didn't win the battles, but he ended up winning the war, or his party won the war.
Yeah. I think what's happened since the 1970s, and we put in this primary system, and along with the witnessing the expansion of the administrative power of the presidency, that parties have been greatly weakened as collective organizations with a past and a future. That is, organizations that have independence from the presidents themselves. So the New Deal Democratic Party, I'm sorry to yell at you. I'm always told I have this like a Fidel Castro style of teaching and discussing politics. But the New Deal Democratic Party endured beyond Franklin Roosevelt's long presidency. And I think Harry Truman was a really good man and a really astute politician, and really consolidated a lot of the New Deal political order. But his election is inconceivable to me in '48 without the creation of the New Deal Democratic Party. He really used that brilliantly in that '48 campaign. And Roosevelt really won another campaign in 1948. That's probably not giving Harry Truman enough credit. But since we've developed this primary system, I think now it's hard to distinguish the president from the party. And I think this was true of Obama. And I think it's even more true of Donald Trump. We refer to the Affordable Care Act as Obamacare. We didn't refer to Social Security as Roosevelt security. It's had some independence from the president. Parties now depend on presidents, I think, in an unhealthy way for their sustenance, to raise money, to mobilize their support, to promote their program, to project their message, and so forth. And I think that weakens parties as collective organizations with a past and future. And although Obama was elected to 2 terms, the Democratic Party suffered badly during his presidency because he distinguished himself from the formal party and saw himself as the head of a movement. And I think Donald Trump has done that to a greater extent. So when I watch what Steve Bannon is doing, I have a hard time distinguishing between transformation and what Schumpeter called creative destruction. I'm really not sure whether he is remaking the Republican Party, which could be an ingredient of a major transformation in American politics, which, for better and worse, depending on your political viewpoint, or it could mean the destruction or the greater weakening of the Republican Party particularly, and the party system in general, and making parties more subordinate to this plebiscitary politics that is always kind of part of the Roosevelt Revolution, but really comes into its own, I think, with the development of the mass media in the 1960s and the development of the primary system that's in place by 1972.
All right, well, let's turn to our audience, and Bill, you get the first question. Alfred is coming your way.
Thank you, Alfred. Thank you, Barbara, and thank you, Sid. That was just terrific. I want to take you back to the beginning of the lecture.
Wow.
And then have it tie back to the end, which is you started with this great debate between Madison and Hamilton about Article 1 and Article 2, separated powers, shared powers. And as you swept across history, you see this rise of the presidency. And I guess maybe implicit in that is the decline of the legislature. And we've really seen that in the last set of years within parties, not just between parties, where the governing party has very little control over its own members. And I guess I wish I'd ask you to comment on that moving forward. While we may be in FDR's administrative state for the foreseeable future, would we all benefit from a stronger Congress as a co-equal branch, as shared power as opposed to separated power? Would that help our views of the presidency and make it less personalized and more collaborative? Is that possible? Am I barking up the wrong tree?
Yeah, it's a great question. It dovetails with the first question Barbara asked me. Does presidential power haunt my days and my and make for nightmares? And I would say I have a hard time envisioning, given the state of play in American politics, the role that the government plays at home and in the world, us going back to where we were at the end of the 19th century, where Congress was still, I think, the strongest institution and worthy of Article 1, of being, of Article 1 status in our Constitution. The refoundings before the New Deal involved extraordinary presidential leadership for their creation, but they really put pretty strong boundaries around the role of the national government and the presidency. Even Lincoln's refounding, once the Civil War is over, then power really goes. A lot of power shifts over to Congress, and by the end of the 19th century, we have these presidents not many people have heard of. We could do a little quiz here. Who is Chester A. Arthur anyway? but I think what happens in the 20th century, I'll get to you in a minute, Albert. I love answering your questions too. I think is we get a shift that the president becomes the prime mover in the political system, and Article 1, if you will, and Congress becomes Article 2, at best. And really, where this is codified is, I think it was in 1946, the Legislative Reorganization Act. Is that true, Russell? And that's where Congress kind of reorganizes itself from being a legislative body to being an oversight body. That's when you really get the creation of the strong committee system, which has been under siege since the Gingrich Revolution in the 1970s, when you weaken those committees in the face of the partisan rancor that's going on now. In Congress. So there's a long way of saying I think we can strengthen Congress as an oversight body, and I think Congress can be restored or must be restored in its two critical constitutional responsibilities: the power of the purse, and the one that really keeps me up at night, the power to declare war, which doesn't exist. Can I hire you to make a lecture, give a lecture with me next time? It'll be the two of us, like. Jerry Martin and Jerry Lewis. Yeah, Congress is not. This is one of the real constitutional scandals of American politics, that Congress has not declared war since the Second World War, yet we have been in near perpetual war, hot and cold, since World War II. And even with the War Powers Resolution being created, Congress doesn't declare war when they, as we put it, authorize war. What they really do, if you look at the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, or the Iraq Resolution, is delegate responsibility to the president to decide when and where to go to war. So that's why people like John Kerry and Hillary Clinton can say, I was for it before I was against it. I thought the president should have this power, but I didn't agree with the way President Bush fought this war. And Bill, I just think that's a terrible thing that the Mileur Center, I know, has committed itself to restoring a semblance of this critical responsibility that Congress has. As Madison said, debates about things like war and peace, there is no bigger decision that can fall to the sovereignty than that decision. But we've made that a matter of executive decision. And I think there's enough concern in the country. This is a teachable moment. And I think there's enough concern in the country to talk seriously about restoring congressional response. Because now what they do is they in a sense just delegate responsibility to the president, and then when they don't like the way things are going, they criticize the president. They don't take any responsibility out, as the Constitution requires for our actions in war and peace. And I think we could go through the same conversation, Bill, with the power of the purse. So I think in terms of oversight, budgetary politics. I mean, when's the last time a real budget was passed? Seriously, when was the last? No, see, again, you're the best. We got to hire you.
Our A student.
What percent? What percent should I give her?
98%.
The power of the purse and the power to declare war. I think those need to be really revisited.
Right. And so Sid mentioned our next agenda here for the Mileur Center, the Presidency at a Crossroads, is to study these very issues. And we're going to be looking at the President and the Constitution again, presidents and policy, both foreign and domestic. Our colleague Mark Silverstone is particularly interested in this issue of war and peace and how presidents get into wars and how they get out of wars. And then presidents and the people and the public, and that was why I asked the question about the media. And I'm particularly interested in presidents as demagogues, and how do we define that? How do we define demagogue? And how do we define which presidents are, and is that always a bad thing? So other questions, other comments that folks have? Again, Alfred, can you get back to Guy, and then we'll come up here to the front.
Wonderful lecture, Sid. I really enjoyed it. As you know, I largely agree with your formulation of the New Deal constitutional order still being in place, and that we haven't had a refounding since the 30s in a constitutional sense. But the thing that strikes me about the period in between, and particularly the 80s and 90s, or even a little earlier, is the distrust in government that emerges from that period. And although Reagan and I think Clinton don't succeed in a refounding, they actually use and deploy that distrust of government in a way that now makes it hard for the president to do the job, as you put the remaining task, or the key task of presidents today. And so I'm curious about your thoughts about that, of how we fit that conundrum of the executive-centered administrative state and its persistence with the fact that the public, or at least large portions of the public, doesn't trust that state to address pressing national problems.
I think that's the leading conundrum or dilemma for modern presidential leadership. And it's one of the things that I think makes difficult restoring some semblance of constitutional sobriety and balance, as Bill was arguing for. I mean, one of the things that I think Ronald Reagan is really a fascinating presidency to look at, and the first Republican president since the Roosevelt presidency to really take on the New Deal. What did he say in that first inaugural address? You'll probably know. In this crisis, government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem. But he attacked government, but he really didn't attack presidential or administrative power, because Reagan, I think, even more than Nixon, was dedicated to showing, after the Republicans were very skeptical, if not opposed, to the full-scale use of the modern executive since the New Deal, to showing that the New Deal ideologically could be a double-edged sword that could cut in a liberal or a conservative direction. But I think what came out of the Reagan era was not a more conservative, new conservative political order, but a fracturing of the New Deal political order. And here I don't simply mean between liberals and conservatives, but of course that's an important part of it. but a disjuncture between people's trust in government and what they still expected from government. That's a dilemma that most modern presidents face, is that people don't have this kind of Ibsen-esque love-hate relationship. Besides reading Hegel, I also read too much Ibsen in college, and all those relationships Ibsen depicts are love-hate relationship. People, in a sense, are critical of the presidency. They don't trust the presidency. But there aren't the voices calling for, like as Bill did, for some restraint on the presidency are rather frail in American politics. The American people consider the presidency synonymous with American government. It's hard to get people to vote in other elections. So I don't know how you resolve that problem. I mean, maybe presidents should be expected to roll back the expectations of the American people, and deprive themselves of these expectations. But good luck with that. But I think you put your finger on a huge problem. I showed my students the graph of trust the other day, and it's really, I think it's like near 80% of the people in 1965 trust the government, and it plunges dramatically. And it goes up a little bit during the Reagan and George W. Bush years.
But it's been bouncing about 25%.
But it's a small bounce, and it's down. I think Congress now is about 11% favorability rating. Yeah.
Yes, a brief question and a brief answer, and we might be able to squeeze one more in.
I spent 4 years in the Marine Corps, dedicated to protecting the Constitution. Now, in all this history, we talk about refounding and refounding again. But what about the founding of the United Nations at the end of the war, and an attempt to do that at the end of World War I? And I think the role of Roosevelt and his wife, Eleanor, in the founding of the United Nations was very profound and fundamental in defending the possibilities of the Constitution, including the limits of the earth to support. And none of the Constitution and the people who discuss it today understand demography. The population of the earth goes up 8,000 every 60 minutes. It'll be 15 billion by the year 2100. And Stephen Hawking suggests seriously that civilization, as we know it, will come to an end in 100 years. I'm 92, and that's a long time. 100 years is not very long. 100 years is not very long from here. But how come we seem to have avoided the founding of the United Nations in this discussion?
I don't know, maybe Mark, my colleague Mark Silverstone, be better at. I mean, that was a big part of the New Deal was liberal internationalism. And the arsenal of democracy, of course, was a collective enterprise to be part of the United Nations. And Roosevelt was FDR was in Wilson's administration. And I think vindicating this idea of the League of Nations was an important part of Roosevelt's presidency, even at Yalta, where he was considered to be frail and sick, didn't know what he was doing. One of the reasons he conceded a lot to Stalin was so he could get the Russians to agree to form the United Nations, as compromised as the original idea was. And this idea of globalism is one that's really central to the current progressive idea of American democracy. But it's now being challenged in a very severe way, and I think, I don't know if Mark would agree with me, but more severely than it's been in a long, long time by this notion of America first. Yeah.
So that's a perfect segue. That question was a perfect segue to two events that we have coming up. So one, as I say, is our 2018 Historical Presidency Lecture Series, which will be on internationalism. And the other is that we have an event coming up in the spring term on America First, on the history of America First and that theory and concept. A quick question and a quick answer, Sid?
I don't give quick answers.
Thanks to you over there, because you expressed kind of what I wanted to say. I feel like in the second half of my life, our culture has spent its time pushing back against the New Deal contract, and we've come up with a couple of doozies. It might help if the government in power, particularly Republicans, would stop lying about trickle-down economics. Enough already. We've proven that it doesn't work, and let's go back to a much more charitable kind of economic system than the one that we now know doesn't work.
Well, I'll give a short, yeah.
Reagan
I'll
and
give
trickle down.
I'll give a short, I hope nonpartisan response. I think where the real budgetary synonymy comes is when Keynesianism meets supply-side economics. Because if you look back at conservatives in the 1920s, like Calvin Coolidge, and I've spent a lot of time studying Calvin Coolidge. I think he's really interesting. He felt it was really important to cut government. He even had the Budget Bureau counting the pencils that people were using, and they had to, before they got a new pencil, they had to show their stubs. And that was fiscal austerity. But Calvin Coolidge wanted to cut taxes, but he felt like that kind of fiscal austerity was important before you could carry out the kind of taxes that he and his Secretary of the Treasury, Mellon, carried out in the 1920s. That was conservative budgetary policy. I think the debate between the New Deal economic program and that program is a legitimate debate. The problem with supply-side economics is that you want to cut taxes, but you're not willing to make the government cuts that are necessary for that. So President Reagan cut taxes, but he expanded tremendously defense spending. And he was unable, of course, to cut Social Security, which has become the third rail of American politics. You touch it, as Tip O'Neill said, and you die. So I think that one of the real problems now is we really don't have a genuine debate about budgetary responsibility. The Democrats defend entitlements. Republicans defend defense and homeland security spending. And neither of those sides of the debate are particularly concerned about a balanced budget, which Roosevelt was concerned about, and Lyndon Johnson, I must say, was concerned. During the end of Lyndon Johnson's presidency, the budget was balanced. He was willing to raise taxes to deal with that.
Right. So yes, Mark.
Super quick, and maybe even on a hopeful note, we might end. Yeah. Sid, first of all, it was great. It's always a joy to listen to you and talk about the president's second. I would stay here till 5:30, but I'm not sure others would. But at the end, you talked about the importance of us thinking institutionally once again. And I was wondering what you thought might be those institutions that are most ripe for us to make inroads on as we think institutionally to make some improvements to the democracy and our constitutional foundations.
Institutions that make inroads, do you mean by strengthen? Or
where it is we might usefully intervene. So
okay.
There are,
I got you.
Institutions are under threat all over the place, whether it's formal institutions, the Fourth Estate, or informal institutions, the kind of norms by which we live by. Where do you think we can make the most positive, constructive inroads in the short term?
I wish I had a really good answer for that. Maybe if you and I go out and have some drinks together, adult beverages together, I could really begin to think properly about that. Barbara and I were talking about this with this group at Aspen, and said, I've been thinking about some really simple things that might help. And I think one of the real important things we need to do is restore the rule of law in American politics, which requires more constructive engagement between the president and Congress. And I'm amazed, even when the president and the Congress share the same party ostensibly, that there's this institutional estrangement that I think has been created by this presidency-centered government. And so maybe it's because I spent 6 months in Oxford, but I think something as simple as the president going to the Congress more than once a year, which is an important event, the State of the Union address, and engaging with Congress in something resembling a question hour, where he's asked questions by members of Congress, he or she. We still might get a she one of these days. And the president has to respond. And sure, it'll be rough and tumble, but at least it won't be the White House tweeting, destructive things at the Congress, and Congress members of Congress claiming the president isn't fit for office. I think that kind of simple change, which wouldn't require a constitutional amendment, would really be a constructive, I'm not saying it would be a game changer, but that's the direction I would like to see the country go. I don't think we're going to really put the president back in the box. I was trying to get some toothpaste back in the tube today. It just won't go. But I do think one way to restore Congress's integrity as an institution, which I think really is one of our greatest crises right now, the weakness of Congress, 11% approval rating, is to get the president to engage with Congress constructively now, to take seriously the idea of debate and lawmaking rather than assuming that the government can be run through unilateral action.
Well, that is a positive note to end on. And do be looking for Sid's next book, which is on presidents and social movements in the law. He's just handed in the manuscript, and so within about a year, we expect that to be out from
It takes a year for
It
academic
does.
presses to do this.
It's from the University of Chicago, so you can be sure Sid will be speaking on that here at the Mileur Center and probably around the country. So please give Sid a warm applause for his great lecture.
Thank you guys. Appreciate you coming.